The facility, a horrible and desolated place. A place shrouded in mystery and dark research. What we are shown during the game is actually just a fraction of the story that took place here. The rest is depicted with blood, ink, and recordings. So today, I'm breaking down Empty Shell's story while adding as much details and explanations as I can. Enjoy. Hi guys, this is Jay. The story of the island and how the facility came to be goes way back. As we start the game, the date is July 19th, 1976, a date we will come back to. But to understand the context, we need to go back to the very beginning. The island was discovered in 1896, 80 years in the past, when a group of Japanese government officials were coming back from New Zealand. They were caught by an unexpected storm, which forced them to change course. This then caused them to stumble upon this island, which wasn't on any record or map. Exhausted and needing to potentially repair the ship, the sailors decided to stop on this island. Being stuck there for a couple of days, some members of the crew were sent to explore the island, and what they found was a bit troubling. On a lonely hill, there was the remains of a sanctuary. On its walls were carvings, symbols of unknown origins and meaning. What happened to this crew is unknown, but one can assume that they made it back to civilization. The knowledge of this island was then carefully preserved to be used at a later date. Let's fast forward to 1947, the year the facility's construction began. A year later, in 1948, the compound was officially operational. The installation plan was made up of multiple massive buildings, each one of them serving a particular purpose. It starts with the East Wing Building C, which is the place containing most of the island energy supply. It continues with Building B, which is used to grow plants and food. Then we have the Transport Center, that is doing exactly what its name implies, and the Aerospace Center, that was designed to work and innovate on different technologies. Finally, deeper into the island is the North Wing and the SSLW Center, where the main project of the facility took place. Between all of these buildings is a large wooden area, where paths have been carved to link most of them. There is also a sewer system and even a hidden cave system. To navigate this huge complex, transports like barges and trains were also planned for the employees. The main focus of this place was a technology called subspeed of light waves, or SSLW, as it's frequently mentioned in the game. This project is in fact a huge scientific machine capable of sending messages a little bit under the speed of light, roughly 30% less. Something that the scientists of the compound tried as soon as the project was completed. In fact, they sent 5 messages throughout the years 1949 to 1954. These messages were sent to the star system that is the closest to our own, Alpha Centauri. At this speed, it would take roughly 5 years for a message to reach Alpha Centauri. So, this is what brings us to December 2nd, 1954. The day the facility received an answer from the stars. What is the exact nature of that answer is never mentioned, but it must have been something truly incomprehensible and otherworldly. I say this because during the next days, bizarre and unexplainable things started to happen on the island. People were showing up to team meetings and nobody else was there. Workers also found the halls of the buildings as well as the cafeteria to be empty at prime time, and maintenance personnel in the cave reported that the walls were pulsating and secreting weird substances. All of this leads to December 10th of the same year, where mainland lost communication with the facility. Re-establishment of a clear line of comms was attempted by the mainland personnel for 7 days straight without any success. A day later, the preparations for an expedition to the island were underway. 25 operators and 11 crew members, that was to be the team. Gas masks, rations, medical kits, generators, and of course weapons. That was to be the gist of the supplies. It would take roughly 11 days for the crew to reach the island. It was also reported that the 25 members of the operational team had a really rapid briefing, and that the information on the mission was minimalistic at best, meaning that they had no information on the layout of the place and what was inside, only a vague mission objective about finding out what happened. During the travel time, there was almost no contact between the crew of the ship and the military personnel, reinforcing the assumption that the 11 crew members probably knew into what kind of hell they were bringing these gentlemen. On January 4th, 1955, the expedition arrived on the shores of the island. This place was weirdly silent. Rain was pouring non-stop, and a peculiar sweet smell was in the air. The men started unloading the supplies and surveying the place. By their judgment, this expedition was grossly undermanned. 25 operators could not possibly cover that much ground. Nevertheless, they headed in, determined to accomplish their mission. What follows is messy at best. Reports of violent and chaotic firefights involving unimaginable horrors like giant human hands, mention of the death of the majority of the operational team, and ultimately loss of communication with the expedition only 2 days after arrival. 4 days later, having no other resort, mainland purged all of the information related to the facility and the expedition. The story of the island and its horrible tragedy would be erased and forgotten for 20 years. That is, until a reconnaissance aircraft reported the presence of lights at the coordinates of the facility in 1975. Shortly after, the decision to form a second expedition was made. This one would be a lot different than the first one. The number of people aboard this second trip is never clearly mentioned. What we know is that it would be made up of quote-unquote volunteers, desperate people who accepted a mysterious job with the promise of money linked to it. What that job involved and where they were going to do it, that they didn't know. The strategy to approach the island would also be changed, as higher-ups on the mainland were now informed that there was something very wrong and dangerous within the facility. With what happened to the first expedition, it would make no sense to disembark the whole crew on the shore again. Instead, they opted for a one-man-at-a-time approach, meaning that the main boat would stay far away from the island and that it would send one volunteer at a time to land on the shores. These men and women would be equipped with chemical protection, including a gas mask and a suit. They would also have some sort of melee weapon, the luckiest of them having an axe or a shovel. Finally, they would also be given a firearm and a list of tasks to perform inside the facility. And that is how the second expedition on the island started, around the 19th of July, 1976. Knowing nothing about this place and what was inside, the volunteers had only the written instructions as guide. And as it would turn out, these instructions were actually meant to restart the facility and the SSLW, which had been shut down. This would be done in multiple steps, each one of them taking them deeper inside the island. First up, they would need to restart the main generator, as well as the laboratories and IT generators, all situated inside Building C in the East Wing. This would allow the key buildings on the island to be supplied with enough power. This is where each volunteer individually had their first contact with the horrors of the compound. Giant human hands were trying to crush them, and equally big mutated spiders were spitting acid and clawing at them. It was as if whatever responded to the scientific signals was experimenting on living creatures it found in the facility, reshaping them to its image. They also had the realization that they were, of course, deceived, and that their lives were now over, unless they could accomplish each task and escape this place. Once the task in Building C was done, their next objective was to realign the satellites used to send the signals in East Wing Building B. After successfully completing the second task, the volunteer would encounter something surprising on its way out. a girl named Miho who was able to survive all this time by hiding and scrounging resources left around in a panic. As the volunteer fought for his life, he would discover that being in this place for so long made Miho develop some telekinesis powers and had also made her lose reason altogether. Once the body of the mutated girl laid lifeless on the ground, the volunteer knew that it was time for the next step in the list. The next objective was the Aerospace Center, but the conventional path to it was blocked. The only other known way to reach it was by using a barge situated in the pier area. To reach that place, he would have to go through the sewers. Passing through this claustrophobic area made the volunteer realize that this was a lot worse than he thought. Some of the people who took refuge here were now mutated with giant tentacles coming out of their neck. These mutations conferred them superhuman strength and resistance, making them very hard to kill. After clearing the flush system, the volunteer was able to exit the sewer system. Before reaching this barge he was told about, the volunteer had one more step to take: the woods. This place was carved with many paths connecting different buildings on the island. Here, the volunteer's instructions were to signal his position via a flare launcher situated on the beach, and then proceed to lower the bridge leading to the pier. When he activated the flare launcher, the volunteer was greeted by a horrifying sight. A giant eye emerged from the sea and started attacking him. The eye had been dormant for 2 decades and had somehow assimilated the technologies studied here on the island. It was able to attack its prey with laser barrage and beams. In a desperate attempt to kill the volunteer, it even tried to roll on the beach to crush him in its path. Triumphant, the volunteer headed towards the bridge where he would be welcomed with another surprise. Once it was lowered, the bridge transported a horde of soulless towards him. Fortunately, heavy weapons were present in the area, which greatly helped in clearing up the way and allowed him to make it to the barge. The barge was practically a death trap, as a ton of mutated monstrosities were hiding beneath the deck. As the lone volunteer was forced to fend them off until he arrived at its destination, he couldn't help but notice that some of the monsters attacking him were wearing military uniforms. The transport he was using was in fact the same boat that the first expedition used to reach the island in 1955, 21 years back. People in charge of this facility seem to have chosen this island for how it was hidden away from the rest of the world. And as you know, this type of motivation never bodes well. Volunteers sent as part of the second expedition were little more than subjects in a horrifying experience created by man. Finally arriving at the Aerospace Center, the task was now to reactivate the SSLW laser engine, which would bring the machine one step closer to be usable once again. This place was a marvel of technology. People there were researching all kinds of things, including weapon prototypes for laser and plasma firearms. It was equally full of monstrosities, like bloated scientists. These members of the chemical division had been mutated and bloated to have a reserve of toxic gas inside of their body, which they could then spit at their prey. There was also a certain amount of heavily harmed soulless. The special gas mask they were wearing and the heavy weapons they were wielding suggested that these were members of the operational team belonging to the first expedition. After rebooting the SSLW laser engine, the subject was able to proceed to the next element on the list. Some things were becoming clearer as the volunteers advanced in the different buildings of the facility. The documents they found and the things they saw brought some form of explanation to the chaos they were witnessing. Something used the signals sent to Alpha Centauri to travel here. Once it was here, it used the island as its playground, experimenting on living beings, cloning them. Sometimes it was entire beings, other times only organs and body parts, which had life of their own. This brought some sort of answers to the volunteers' many questions, but this did not make this nightmarish environment any more natural. It was still driving them to the verge of insanity. They had to hurry. At the transport center, the goal was to restore the train platforms and rails, as well as the GPS system linked to them. This would take the Volunteer to the North Wing, where the SSLW was located. This part of the facility was full of toxic gas due to the unstable chemical substance stored within its walls. This meant that one would have to wear a special gas mask to go through all of that toxic waste. During his time in this disturbing place, the Volunteer would come across highly mutated scientists that would come to be called plants, having the same tentacles coming out of their heads as the ones seen in the sewers. This bigger version also had acquired some telekinesis powers similar to the girl Miho, and that made them highly dangerous. But these things were the least of the Volunteer's troubles, as right before he could board the train, the subject was faced by a nightmarish contraption, a giant heart, encircled by a metal ring which housed different weapons, going from lasers to grenade launchers. This abomination really made the Volunteer realize that the entity could go to unlimited length in its experiments. After dealing with the unnaturally big heart, the Volunteer had a choice to make, as one of the trains led to the Building B of the North Wing, while the other led to the mysterious caves. This particular Volunteer chose to head towards the Building B of the North Wing, not to confuse with the Building B at the beginning of the story. This was a different one, closer to the SSLW Center. Aboard the train, a situation similar to the one on the barge occurred, as it was also full of monsters created by the entity, including twin-blade soulless and abomination called Scissors, which both had grown blades at the extremities of their limbs to eviscerate their victims. Arriving in the North Wing, the Volunteer had one last building to go through before the SSLW Center. The building in question did not seem to have received the power from the generators in Building C. This meant an even more slow and methodical advance in the haunted halls, as this place was really dark. The task was only to get the giant door open, and after that, there would be one last stretch. Finally, at the SSLW Center, exhausted, the Volunteer knew what he had to do. Transfer the power from the generators to the SSLW system, so that it could be rebooted and once again be functional. In his quest to do just that, the Volunteer realized that the SSLW system could be overloaded if he diverted enough power towards it. This would of course mean his death, and probably the disappearance of the entire facility. Yeah, it was probably the right thing to do. That would put an end to this nightmare once and for all, he thought. But the Volunteer was only human like you and me, and the hope of once again seeing civilization and a normal life most definitely pushed him to reboot the SSLW system so that it could once again be used, as this was his task. Before he could finalize the process, he was confronted by the most insane thing he had seen so far. A giant brain sitting in the middle of the main room. Similar to the heart, the entity of Alpha Centauri had reproduced and mutated a human brain. This abomination was well capable of defending itself with different types of attacks. It was also responsible for controlling the other monsters present throughout the facility, acting as some sort of hive mind. The Volunteer gathered all his remaining sanity and fought the monster head-on with all he had. Barely surviving the encounter, he then proceeded to restart the SSLW system. Finally coming out of the facility, the surviving Volunteer was greeted by a man and 2 guards. This nightmare is finally over, he thought. I have done all they asked. A few words were exchanged with the man, and then the guards proceeded to terminate the Volunteer. All the hope he had placed in them was in vain. This signaled the end of the second expedition, roughly around the 22nd of July, 1976. The depending on how much time it took you to complete the game. After this, a conversation between two persons, probably from mainland, details the status of the situation. One of them signaling that the results of the second expedition were positive and that the facility was now considered as approachable. It is also mentioned that a third expedition of professionals will soon be organized. This sounds a lot like the first expedition that took place 21 years ago, but no more details are given. The transcript ends with one of the men asking to get the cosmonauts ready. That single sentence can be linked to a lot of things, and this is where we go deeper in the rabbit hole to find out the whole truth about this project. During the second expedition, the volunteers that were sent inside the facility found a lot of information in the form of notes and recordings. Some of these were written and recorded by scientists and people of the facility still trying to understand what was happening even after the loss of communication with mainland. Some of these people continued their research until their last moments. This allows us to understand that the entity was entering each being present on the island, that it scanned their bodies, and that it then returned to the point of origin with the biological information. All of this was possible because of the SSLW, and it would then allow this entity from Alpha Centauri to clone and change the physical composition of the living organisms on the island, just like an absurd experiment. This explains all of the monsters that the many volunteers have seen throughout their struggle. Additionally, some secret information detailing the journal of a doctor part of the medical division was also found. These entries are about a patient that the doctor received in the month of July 1954. This patient had a blank stare, had difficulty making full sentences, and seemed paranoid or panicked most of the time. He was constantly whispering sentences like, "I've been there and I don't want to go back." He also claims that he was part of a mission of some sort, and that he stole an element of said mission and stashed it in his room. When the doctor later came in possession of said element, the situation was clear. A photograph depicting a strange landscape and two suns in the background. Alpha Centauri is composed of 3 stars, 2 of them being similar to our own sun. They are very close to each other and are often said to form a binary pair. The 3rd star is actually a red dwarf called Proxima Centauri. With that information, it is clear that the facility found a way to send people on Proxima Centauri using the SSLW. And using the same method, something was able to come back to Earth. All of this happened before the loss of communication with mainland, and the conversation that we see at the end of the game meant that they were preparing to do it again. Then, in 1979, 3 years after the end of the second expedition, a new project was underway. Volunteers would be recruited in a similar fashion and then sent into a test room to survive as long as possible. One of these volunteers managed to escape and take one of the guards hostage. The guard then revealed some information regarding the whole SSLW project. Through this flow of information, it was mentioned that the cosmonauts were sent to Alpha Centauri via the South Wing, which we never explore in the game. Now, I've done my best to compile all of the information available about the island, but as it can be seen here, the facility is actually enormous, meaning that there might be a lot more that we don't know about this place. It's important to mention that if you actually overload the generator in the final level of the game, the entire facility explodes. For this reason, I did not consider this ending to be quote-unquote canon, since 2 other empty shell games have been announced. The Loop, for one, is set to be a roguelike where you go through test rooms similar to the one mentioned previously. This would be set in a new structure on the island, where they use volunteers to test new things. Then there is of course Empty Shell 2, and from what I could gather, it seems like we're going back to the same facility, so this makes the alternate ending less probable, but who knows. Also, at the transport center, You can take the train to the caves instead of the North Wing Building B. In that place, you discover a lot of notes of people who survived sometimes after the incident. There's even mentions of them resisting the onslaught and barricading themselves. It's also full of disgusting eyes coming out of the walls, which meant that the entity somehow had the power to transform the walls of the cave, but not the ones elsewhere. And that covers the entirety of the known timeline in Empty Shell. We went through the construction of the facility, the first and second expedition, and finally the explanation of the SSLW project. Now, I want to know what you think. Let's talk about anything related to Empty Shell's story and lore down in the comments. If you stayed until this point, chances are you found this game as well as the video interesting. If you want to see more of it, I'll put my review of the game in the description. Take care of yourself, happy gaming, and I will see you in the next step of our odyssey.